what I'm doing right now is talking you through, just sit down, open your computer, and download stuff. I am talking you through very quickly, making connections from the Song to the Yuan to the Ming. Okay, we are focusing on just very tight connections here. So, first of all, this is the Song Dynasty in its entirety. After the Tang fell, the Song, as you know, as you should know because you've read about it, but just to reinforce that, the Song was once again a unified China, so it had the north and the south. But if you notice up here to the north, there's these Jurchens, nomadic or semi-nomadic, quote, barbarians from the Chinese point of view. And notice they're up there in Manchuria. And this will be interesting to you a little bit later when we get to the Qings, because the Qings are a Manchu foreign dynasty too. Anyway, so that's the whole song, which is also called the Northern Song, because about halfway through the song, oh, sorry, backing up. I hate this. I really like to stand up and point. This is significant because, as you should remember just from general conversations and discussions, the Silk Road starts in Chang'an, today's Xi'an, the capital city of all of the dynasties that had the Yellow River in their territory. And so this was a seriously huge source of Chinese revenue, economic revenue, the Silk Road. So when the Jurchens, look at the new map, when the Jurchens conquered northern China and created the Jin Dynasty, J-I-N, they took the Silk Road. So once again, we have barbarian nomads controlling the north, just like in the, what was the last time that happened? What was the last time that happened? During the period of disunity, the Xinbei, if you remember, the northern way. The guys who Sinicized, those barbarians who Sinicized. So here we are again. We've got nomads who come in and they take the north. You would think that China would suffer a crippling blow from this, because they've lost their main source of trade to the rest of Eurasia by being reduced to now the southern half, basically the Yangtze South. But instead, they do, and here's a sort of a better or a different way of saying it. This is all of the Song, and then the northern Song when the Jin came in. So again, you just got the southern half there. And so with the loss of that revenue, with the loss of the Silk Road, what does the Southern Song do? They turn to trade. They start a shipbuilding industry in the South. It's imperially sponsored. It's a government-sponsored shipbuilding thing. And their shipbuilding technology is unparalleled worldwide. They are making the biggest and most sophisticated engineering of ships. They have watertight compartments, for example, in the hull. Ship runs into rocks, it breaks the hull, which is the bottom part of the ship. If that hull is not compartmentalized, first of all, and watertight, second of all, then it's going to flood because the bottom of the ship is just going to fill up with water. So what do the Chinese do? They compartmentalize, make separate compartments in the bottom of the ship, the hull, and then they waterproof them. In the days before plastic, they waterproof them so that if there is a hole in the hull, it's only going to flood one of those compartments in the bottom of the ship, and the rest will still have air in it, so it will still float, right? So, does that make sense? So, your ships are large, and long story short, the Southern Song uses these to start trading down south. They come down here to Malacca, Malaysia, over into Indonesia, and then around this peninsula and up into India, and quickly become the major trading force, international trading force, navally, or sea trading force in the Asian world. There's so much to say about the Song. 300-year dynasty when you compare north and south. And just to underline this one last time, because there are a couple of turning points in world history, and this is one. Unlike all of the other dynasties, the Song Dynasty, and hear this, the Song Dynasty did not do that dynastic cycle. Normally over 300 years, it peaks about halfway through, the Anlushan Rebellion and the Tang, halfway through, and after that the Tang declines for the second half. The same with the Han, if you remember, right? Western Han strong, about halfway through the Wang-Mang Rebellion, and then the Eastern Han decline. The Song never declined. For 300 years, it was just really well run. The biggest reason is that they were hardcore Confucianists. This is seriously important. The first ones to say, you know what, the only way you can become a scholar official in the government, which is the elite job on top of the social pyramid, the only way you can do that is to pass an examination. No more who's your daddy, no more how much money do you have. The only way to do it is you've got to prove your smarts in the most bizarre, hardcore testing conditions you've ever seen in your life. You are locked into a room for 3 days, and you cannot leave. You have to pee in a pot and poop in a pot and all that sort of thing, and you are monitored and guarded in this little private room where you sleep and test for 3 days. It was the SAT in the 11th century. So anyway, so because of this reason, the Confucian government was really decent. They were really serious about not being corrupt and all sorts of things. So it's a really boring dynasty in terms of like inner court, outer court politics, scandals, intrigues. None of that happens. There's nothing scandalous about this 300-year Song Dynasty. So it's just going up and up and up. It has an industrial revolution. They're producing more steel than England produced in the 17 and 1800s. They're making suspension bridges out of steel. They have a publishing industry. They've invented books and printing, mass printing, block printing. And so libraries are exploding. They were on the cusp of an industrial revolution. They were using water power, they had coal, everything that England had 500 years later. They had and they were using. Again, just hear that steel production, suspension bridges, all sorts of engineering stuff. Commercially, because of the international trade by sea, it required banking and credit and checking and all sorts of things so that merchants could trade on the other side of the Indian Ocean without carrying all their cash with them, using letters of credit. And so you have modern banking and all sorts of things popping up in the 1000s, 1100s, 1200s. But unfortunately, to the north of them, the Jurchens are only half their problem. The Jurchens take the northern half, but to the north of the Jurchens is the Mongols. Genghis Khan. And if you look at this map, you'll see that the Mongols captured, their empire was the biggest empire the world has ever seen, from Korea all the way over to Europe. From a tribe of nomadic horsemen in the Mongolian steppe of about 1.5 million total, 1.5 million people, a quarter of the size of Singapore, were able to conquer the entire Eurasian continent, basically. Yeah.
What about Kublai Khan?
Kublai Khan is Genghis Khan's grandson. We'll get there. So, and notice this: the Mongols had conquered all of this area, under Genghis Khan, except for China. They couldn't conquer China. They saved that for last. They couldn't do it. They could do everything else, and it only makes sense because China's massive, it's got great walls, all sorts of stuff. Whereas the rest of these are much easier to conquer. I'm just going to read you a great little taste of the Mongols. The Mongols' great military advantage was mobility, their brilliant use of cavalry tactics, controlled by the ingenious use of signal flags, plus their powerful but short compound reflex bow, which they could load and fire from a gallop. These guys are on horseback, and they're able to load and fire accurately a crossbow while galloping on horseback.
So it's basically a horseback shooting.
It's like what?
Horseback shooting.
A horseback, yes. They could cover 100 miles a day in forced marches. They didn't have a baggage train because they carried all of their rations in their saddlebags. So there weren't any like wagons with supplies. No, if you were a soldier, you carried your own supplies on your horse. So they could go 100 miles a day. That's impressive even by today's standards. When pressed, I love this part, they knew how to open a vein in the necks of their steppe ponies. The Mongols' horses were little bitty pony-looking things. They're still in China. If you go to northern China, like Inner Mongolia and such, you'll see over Yunnan, the Tibetans. They're little bitty things that look like ponies. You're like, oh, look at that little, But no, these things were bad. They conquered the world with them. They could open the necks of their ponies and drink blood, and then close it again, so that the horse was fine, and the rider was fine. The rider has nutrition and such from the blood, gets back on the horse, and on they go. Through Kublai Khan's time, the Mongols rarely lost an engagement, and even more rarely a campaign. Those who resisted, how did 1.5 million people conquer 100 million probably? Those who resisted were commonly butchered to a man, and their women and children raped, slaughtered, or enslaved. The terror of the Mongol record demoralized their opponents, who described them as inhuman monsters. They were certainly expert practitioners of psychological warfare, and even employed spies or agents. Check this out, psychological warfare. Spies or agents to spread horrifying stories of their irresistible force and their ruthlessness towards any resistors. So they would send guys, say, you go up to the next town and talk about how brutal and terrifying we were. Exaggerate it. Say that we, chopped them into tiny pieces lengthwise, right? So by the time we get there, they're just like, look what we give, right? We're terrified, whatever you want. And then they would make those conquests. You're either going to fight with us or we're going to kill you. And so that's how their army grew. Every time they conquered a place, they took all the men and their army just exploded, conquest by conquest. Genghis, as a true steppe nomad, and here's our last little detail, especially hated cities and city dwellers, and made a series of horrible examples of them, often leaving no one alive. Genghis is said to have remarked that, quote, what's Genghis Khan like to do? The greatest pleasure is to vanquish one's enemies, to rob them of their wealth, and to see those dear to them bathed in tears, to ride their horses and clasp to your bosom their wives and daughters. In other words, before I kill you, I'm going to rape your wife and daughter in front of you to just completely devastate you, and then I'm going to kill you because I hate city dwellers, and there's nothing more pleasurable than doing this to people who don't just surrender. The guy was monstrous. The Mongols loved the violence and pride of conquest, but had little understanding of or interest in administration, and their empire began to fall apart within a few years of its acquisition. So that's the Mongols. Now that's Genghis Khan. So that's the Mongol Empire. This is going on while China is on the brink of an industrial revolution. China is like England 200 years ago. And so how does this Song Dynasty upward trajectory end? Kublai Khan and the Mongols come in and they wipe out China. If Genghis Khan had been around 200 years earlier or 200 years later, scholars are agreed that China was on the path to have an industrial revolution 500, 600, 700 years before Europe did. This is a major and fascinating turning point in history, because had they had the Industrial Revolution, they would have been the ones with the military technology superiority, not Europe, not anywhere else. And so they would have been poised to rule the world. And they're a very different civilization. If you just let yourself play with this idea, how would a Confucian-run world be different from a capitalist Christian-run world, to put it in a nutshell? Because who won, the capitalist Christian Europeans, right? But,
Sandwiches for all men. That's what he
sandwiches for all men. Okay, so that's the end of the song. Okay, the last thing to tell you about the Yuan Dynasty. So the Mongols of Kublai Khan, the Mongols of Kublai Khan, they are the Yuan, Y-U-A-N. Song-Yuan-Ming. So the Yuan is the Mongols under Kublai Khan. It was a very short dynasty. It only lasted for about 100 years. But during that time, notice, they controlled this entire area. And this is another amazing thing about this period of history. I said at the beginning of the year, Europe discovered North and South America before it reached China, at least by sea. Marco Polo, because of this Yuan dynasty, was a European from Venice, Italy, who was able to walk or travel all the way across Eurasia. Normally impossible to do, bandits, armies, whatever. But Genghis Khan pacified this entire area. So if you think of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which made trade, international long-distance trade, very, very safe. Well, the Mongols did the same thing. And so a European comes, Marco Polo, and he serves in the court of Kublai Khan. Marco Polo is serving the Mongol Emperor of China. And he writes a book about this post-Song Dynasty, commercial, industrial, everything, civilization called the Travels. And in it he says, let's see, the most detailed descriptions and the greatest superlatives that Marco Polo had, because he traveled all over the place, he went to India and everywhere, were reserved for the capital city of the Yuan, whose splendors were beyond compare. To this city he said this, quote, everything that is most rare and valuable in all parts of the world finds its way here. For not fewer than 1,000 carriages and pack horses loaded with raw silk make their daily entry into the capital city. 1,000 horses packed with raw silk every day coming into the city, he describes. And gold tissues and silks of various kinds are manufactured to an immense extent. So he is talking about how incredibly wealthy, even in the Yuan, when it's run by these Mongols, still, the foundation for the song was there, commercially and such. So he writes this book when he gets back to Italy, and Europeans start reading it. And one of the Europeans who read it was Christopher Columbus.
Oh, what?
And Christopher Columbus carried that book with him because what was he looking for? He was looking for China and India, the Spice Islands, right? Europeans didn't know where these things were because they had never been here. So because Marco Polo was able 100 years before Columbus to go to China and see it and write about it and talk about how wealthy it was, the Europeans are like, we got to find this place, okay?
He didn't tell them how to get there.
He didn't follow the same route that Marco Polo.
Well, the problem with that, okay, in a nutshell, this is not a world history course. The Europeans were boxed in by the Muslims. North Africa and the Middle East, all Muslim. And the Crusades, Christians and Muslims don't get along. So the Europeans couldn't go across Muslim territory after the Mongol Kublai Khan empire fell. And so they were looking for sea routes. Right? We've got to go around them. And so that's why the Portuguese started going south to Africa, saying, is there a bottom of Africa that we can round? Or is the world round? Can we go just west to arrive east? So they're looking for sea routes, okay? Because the Muslims, that's their problem. Because right now, everything that they're buying, silks, spices, whatever in Europe, who's the middleman? The Muslims. And the Europeans hate the Muslims. But they're having to pay Muslim middlemen, merchants, for Chinese and Indian products. So, that's pretty cool. Yeah. Again, the Yuan Dynasty is very short-lived. Kublai Khan was actually not a bad emperor, but he did discriminate very much against the Chinese, who blames him. The Chinese are going to try to overthrow him, so instead he puts people from all over the empire in positions of authority. And so the Chinese, for the first time, this is important too. If you remember the Song Dynasty, just real briefly, they were so open to the world. In their capital city, they had Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, Jews, all living and worshiping in their capital city with government approval. We are open to all of you. We love your music. We're doing art about like all this international culture. We're painting them. We're totally fascinated by all you guys. We're open and tolerant. But that was before the Mongols came in and said, okay, new laws, new rules. No Chinese in positions of authority. People who are foreigners get better treatment under the law and the economy than the Chinese. So the Chinese are made an underclass by the Mongols, by Kublai Khan. And so this sort of turns China from an open and outward-looking civilization, inclusive and tolerant, to suddenly we're not so excited about foreigners coming to our land. As I said, Kublai Khan was not a bad administrator, but when he died, the succession problem, who's going to take the throne? The Mongol way of doing that, believe it or not, was to fight. Man to man, let's wrestle, let's fight. And so a series of Mongol successors were claiming and fighting and killing each other, and it just turned into a chaotic nightmare. And a new religious group called the Red Turbans, this time, rose up, as a rebellion, and they overthrew and declared our next dynasty, Song-Yuan-Ming. Okay, and so that's the Ming. Okay, that's it. Any questions? The important thing to note there is the influence of the role of the Mongols in connecting East and West, Marco Polo and China. For the first time they've made contact. But then when the Mongols fell, that contact is lost, it's impossible. And so that opens the door for Europeans to start looking for another way. From this point on, in the main, that's when the Europeans come. So we're gonna, for the rest of the year, it's gonna be semester, it's gonna be East-West clash. Chinese versus European, all right? It's a new chapter. Globalization's here. All right, now, and the first person to make it, the first group to make it to China are the Portuguese. The age of exploration. You think about the map of Europe, Portugal's on the very, very southwestern tip on the Atlantic Ocean, so they've got the naval advantage, the seafaring advantage, because they're right there on the Atlantic, closest to be able to go down the African coast and look for that little way around. So Portugal is our first big actor in the Indian Ocean, okay? The readings that I asked you to download right now, read the directions on the blog. You are going to write about this notice. You're going to write about these questions. When the Europeans go into the Indian Ocean, it's the first time that they have actually sailed to India. What are their motives? Why are they exploring? I mean, you already sort of know these questions aren't hard, but I want you to reflectively show insights about it. So, religion and economics. What is the role of those in their motives and behavior? Europeans go into the Indian Ocean, they see Muslims, Hindus, Confucians, all sorts of stuff. How does religion play into it from the European's perspective, and how does economics play into it? Use specific details from your reading to back that up. So that's what you're looking for as you read. Notice, here are the page numbers. Don't read the entire packet, read these sections. Motives for expansion on page 215, 213. So you're just reading 13, 14, 15, 19, and 20. And I'm going to give you about 15 minutes to do that.